Welcome back, everybody. I am Kyla Kofer, your host of Leadership School, and I'm really excited about talking today with my friend David Dawdy. So David is a psychologist with the Michigan Department of Corrections. He works in their mental health department, and he's really passionate about improving the re-entry process for those involved in the criminal justice system. So he works with them in transition, works with communities, and he's really talks a lot about trauma-informed care and trauma-informed communities. So how does that apply here to our leadership? It is such a good conversation. We are talking about what does it look like as a leader to lead people who have a history of trauma. We're asking some really big questions about how do you pay attention? How do you notice? To what do you do? And what actions do you take? So make sure you listen all the way to the end, because especially at the end, we have some really good nuggets about what to do when someone approaches you with their trauma story. This conversation was really interesting, and I got to talk a lot about some of the work that I do here in Nashville, Tennessee with the Nashville Prostitution Solicitation School, which is not something I've talked a lot about in the past, but I do talk a lot about it in depth here in this conversation. And I'm really proud of the work that I do there. So join me to listen to David Dawdy. I'm so glad that you're here. Thanks for joining. And please let us know what you think and enjoy the episode. Welcome to the Leadership School podcast. I'm your host, leadership and self-care coach, Kyla Kofer. Here at the Leadership School, you'll hear leaders from around the world sharing their stories and expertise on how to lead with balance and integrity. Our goal? Teach you how to be an extraordinary leader. Thank you so much for doing this. So I've really enjoyed our conversations in our mental health resiliency group, which has been really fun. So I'm here with David Dawdy, and David, you and I met through a speaking group, and we've kind of all pulled together a smaller group of people who kind of talk about similar things. And so we met through that. And once I heard what you were talking about, I just had to interview you for Leadership School. And so I'm really excited. Why don't you go ahead and just tell us a little bit about you and what you do? And then I've got some really fun questions coming up.
Awesome. Looking forward to that. Yes, so I'm David Dawdy, and I am in my day job that takes up a lot of time, the mental health director for the Michigan Department of Corrections. And I should probably just state that I'm not speaking on behalf of the Department of Corrections right now, but I have about 20 years of experience with corrections in doing this role as a psychologist and as a supervisor, and now I'm an administrator, of course, with them, and have learned a lot of things along the way. One of the things I've gotten really interested in is speaking about the trauma issues related to people that get involved in our justice system in any capacity, whether that's just getting arrested or some kind of a call for domestic violence and police show up at people's house, or people that end up in jail or going to prison and coming back and trying to reintegrate into regular life. So I've learned a lot along the way about what those trauma and resiliency issues look like for those folks, and really got a passion to talk about that and see if there are ways that we can improve, in particular, the reentry process for people with behavioral health issues of any kind that have become involved in the justice system.
Yeah, and this is exactly why I wanted to talk to you, because the people listening are in leadership roles or looking for leadership roles. And a lot of people we lead have issues with trauma and have a history of trauma. And I guess what would be I don't know if this is even a statistic that we can say, but if there's a percentage that you could say of people who have trauma in their past?
I don't really know in general, but what I have learned about people that end up in the justice system, and they've learned this by looking at folks that end up in mental health diversion courts or drug courts and things like that, is something like 96% of women and 89% of men acknowledge some kind of a trauma. And what they've done is use like the ACE scoring, the ACE questionnaire, to determine if people have some kind of a traumatic history. I don't recall the particular study, but that difference between men and women, 89%, 96%, really is not a statistical significant difference. And probably can be accounted for a lot by the fact that men tend to underreport when they have been severely traumatized, or downplay it and say, oh, that wasn't really a trauma, it's just something I went through.
Sure. Well, I think that's a really important statistic. So when you first say that, I'm thinking, I'm almost shocked, but not shocked. It's like you kind of expect it, but then when you hear that number, you go, oh my gosh, that's a really high number of people who've gone through trauma in the criminal justice system. But how does this apply to leaders? Well, the reason I wanted to have you here is because a lot of people in leadership roles, you're leading people who have experience with trauma, and the possibility of hiring somebody, working with somebody who has a history of being in the criminal justice system is pretty high. Really, we have a lot of people who go through that system in one form or another. So I think it's a really important topic for leaders to know and be aware of, because we can tend to hear, oh, I was arrested once. And then you put this idea in your head of, oh, that person, you know?
Exactly. So I've got a ton of thoughts coming through my head as you say that. And the one thing I wanted to say was, with numbers like that, we can universally assume that if someone has been involved in our justice system, they've gone through significant trauma in their life, if they're not having active symptoms of PTSD or some other kind of trauma response. We can assume that that's the case with them. And then I also think about, in regard to something you just said, with employers, we've been working hard in a lot of states to get rid of that little checkbox. In Michigan, where I live, we just called it ban the box, because there was a little checkbox on the top of employment applications that said, have you ever committed a felony or convicted of committing a felony? And that relegated a lot of people into these kind of unemployable categories. And so as we work to get rid of things like that and destigmatize this justice involvement, and I could go on with a lot related to that as well, and hopefully we will, that's going to open some doors for people in a good way, and in some ways that have some hurdles and barriers for people to work through, to have these opportunities to work, to get involved with people that have this kind of a checkered past or a significantly problematic past, and they're trying to get back on their feet. And I don't remember the exact percentage, but I think it's over 95% of people that end up going to prison. Jail is probably even higher, because most people only spend 1 to 2 years in a jail, but state prison is where people spend longer sentences. They end up on parole, or they get released on a maximum sentence back to their communities. I think sometimes in our heads, we don't think about that much as a regular citizen. Somebody goes to prison and they're going there and they're going to be punished for their crime, and we're not going to have to worry about that anymore. But they come back, and sometimes they come back without much welcome, and there's this big chunk of time that's had to pass, and they've had to deal with all of this stuff along the way. And of course, there was a big impact on the community and family and all kinds of issues from the crime that occurred. There's a lot to think about and get prepared for.
So I've heard for a while this term trauma-informed leadership. Can you explain what that term means, and how do you become a trauma-informed leader? What does that look like in a leadership role?
I can talk pretty well to what it means to be trauma-informed. And there are lots of different ways that we can use that in our society, whether that be in a caretaking profession or in leadership or just in your work and being aware of the people around you. And what it really means is, I'll talk about this justice-involved population, since that's what I'm most familiar with, and that high percentage of people that have been traumatized. And starting with that universal assumption that if you are working with people in the justice system, you can assume that there has been one or multiple traumas that have occurred. But not only with the people that you might be employing or caring for, but the people that work alongside you may have experienced trauma, whether that was from seeing something happen in a secondary type of a trauma situation, or hearing about something. And you think about, say, a treatment center that works with mental health issues or substance use issues. You hear about those things all day long in your work sometimes, and that can be really difficult, stressful, and sometimes that secondary trauma comes on to the folks that work with those individuals. I would say all the time it does, but different people have different levels of resiliency and ability to manage the feelings that come up. But we're all human, and we have our points at which we've got to step back, do some self-care and those kinds of things. So that's the first step of being trauma informed.
Is just being aware, is having that awareness that most likely that someone you've interacted with has experienced some kind of a trauma.
Yeah. So before I go into the second part, this really part B to that is that trauma has had a significant impact on that individual. And it shows up in a lot of different ways. It can show up in their stress level. You don't know what they're coming in with on a day-to-day basis. Whenever somebody asks me for, say, a one-sentence encapsulation of what's trauma-informed really about, it's about, instead of saying to the person, why are you like this? Or why did you do that? Then saying, what happened to you? What have you been through? What's going on? And that's really the essence of being trauma-informed, is turning that around to be really interested in what that individual has gone through.
That's just I give this tip a lot of it's a really smart question to ask, to start with the what and not with the why. Because whenever you ask a question with the why, instantly that other person feels defensive. Why did you do this? Well, I don't, and just that person feels defensive. But if you turn it into the what, it becomes a story. And then you're opening the chance of building a relationship. I mean, I have to practice this with my kids too. And that we have to practice it and with my coaching and with anybody. It's really important to think through our questions. Let's be smart about the questions that we're asking people. And it just says that we care and that we want to know more. We're just to be open learners, that I care about you and who you are. So that makes a lot of sense to me and the way that I think and approach questioning and learning.
And that leads right into the next part of it that I think is the most important, is realizing that different individuals respond very differently to trauma. Trauma is a lot about perception. How did this impact the person? Not whether that tornado hurt one person or didn't hurt another, or whether it was hard for one person and another person walks away without any emotional or physical issue from it. All of those things impact people differently. And we really have to approach people on an individualized basis and be willing to accept their story, like we just talked about, and that what their experience internally and externally was like is just a real thing. And that's where they're at right now.
Yeah. So it's the opposite of gaslighting, where, you're saying like, well, just because it was your experience doesn't mean the way that I meant it. So like when you say, oh, it wasn't really that bad. Well, it might not have been bad to you, but that person experienced it totally different. So to say that downgrades their experience and what they're feeling and their emotions, and you have no idea why it impacted them in that reason or that way. So to say, well, it's not really that bad, or just let it go. Comments like that can be really, really hurtful, because someone is seeing, I can't believe you're just telling me to let this go when I have experienced this really heavy thing and it's really hurtful to me, So it's, again, taking that extra level to actually care about a person and who you're interacting with. And this is really helpful for coworkers too, just to say, well, that mistake, it's no big deal. We'll just let it go, whatever. When someone might feel like be carrying the weight of the shame of mistake for weeks and weeks and weeks because of who knows.
Yeah, exactly. And we all come to the table with a different risk level or resiliency level. And with everything that we've experienced from our childhood on might leave us really vulnerable to a significant life event, or it might make us really strong in the face of that. And you don't get to choose how you show up in the world with or without those things that make people able to withstand the stress of what's thrown at all of us.
Sure. Well, it's interesting that we're talking about resiliency. One of my previous episodes was with Derek McManus, who talks about his human model of durability and resiliency. And he would say that we don't get to choose what happens to us, but we do get to choose how we respond and how we continue to let that affect our lives. But if you haven't been educated on how to do that, and if you don't have tools and resources how to do that, you're just left wandering and trying to survive and get through this experience and through this life in a way that makes sense to you. But if you are given some of these tools and resources to go, okay, how do you want to show up for the next 60 years? You can make some of those decisions, but that still doesn't mean that when you hear a loud noise, you don't shrink up.
Yes, that's exactly right. And people that have all these traumatic backgrounds, you think about people that I have seen and worked with inside of a prison, and they just never had a shot. You wonder how they ever survived. Born to a crack addicted mother, sold into sexual acts by the mother for drugs. And then they end up acting out. They start going into foster care, juvenile justice systems as a very young person. And when your life has been like that, it's really hard to place much value on your life. And when you don't value your own life, it's really hard to value anybody else's either. And so you turn that around and it starts going out towards other people, and you end up doing something that puts you in prison and has really damaged a whole lot of people's lives. And that cycle of violence just really becomes problematic, and something that I think we've got to learn to stop. And by not just educating people, but that's where it starts, but giving people the tools and some resources and the knowledge to know these things happen. That question, what happened to you, is really significant for somebody. It values the person.
If I'm thinking in an employment situation, if somebody said what happened to you, I might not be willing to share my story. So also having the space for going, hey, if you ever want to share your story, I'd love to hear it, but I'm not going to force you to do that. Like, I'm here, I respect you, I honor you and your story, but also we can just work. That's fine too. But to not force someone to tell their story because they might not be ready to tell it ever.
Right. And that might not be the right context of your relationship ever to have much about that, but to know that that could be something significant that somebody should go and do with somebody else that's important to them is a good thing.
Would it be helpful to say something like, is there a part of your story that would be helpful for me to know to help you best do your job?
I like that a lot.
Or to say things like, are there resources that I can help you find depending on where you're at in your life? Like, what if this person really needs therapy and can't afford it? Maybe that's something that the employer could do, is to be able to say, hey, we have an EAP plan, or how about I put together that for you so that I can contribute to the cost of therapy so that you feel like you're more whole person, but also realizing if you're going to think money, companies like to think monetarily. So how would this benefit them other than just caring for people? But when people feel better, they do better at work. So if you need a reason to satisfy that pocketbook, then you can think, if I invest in this person, they'll invest back in me too.
Yeah, that's really good. And I like those questions. You're making me think of, I have a training that I deliver, but it takes about 4 hours. And this is just for people involved in the justice system and to understand what this, it's called How Being Trauma Informed Improves Criminal Justice Outcomes. And so we can give it to judges or prosecutors. We can give it to people that work in parole, probation, or law enforcement, all kinds of situations like that. And so it's a lot of information. And I bring that up because there are opportunities for folks that work with justice involved people to learn more. And it's certainly not something that we can completely encapsulate in a podcast, but there are resources that somebody should go to if they really want to get better at that.
Wow, I love to hear that training. I'm going to put that in the show notes for everybody. Well, at least your contact information if they want to reach you for that training. But we just had the judicial election here in Nashville, Tennessee, and actually went through it. Like, typically I get a little bit overwhelmed with that many people on a ballot, but I was like, I need to go through this. And it was interesting as I noticed that I was picking people who I thought could do this type of work, because Nashville has actually, from what I've seen, has a long way to go, but has come a long way as far as being trauma-informed and care. Something I haven't talked about publicly a lot is my participation with the Nashville John School. It's for men who've been arrested for solicitation. They have to come to this day-long program on, it's not learning how to, it's learning how not to, but it's learning like the dangers of prostitution and the people that it affects. And it's really amazing the work that is being done in that class. But it's a court-ordered program because it's this understanding of there needs to be more education. And the more people are educated, the less they're likely to do these crimes. And then there's also really some great systems in place for the women. And Nashville has done, what I've seen, a decent job. There's always better that we can do, but it's fun thinking about, okay, man, how much better could we do if we had parole officers in this kind of training, and police officers doing trauma-informed training. I think this is really important.
Yeah, and a lot of agencies are learning these concepts throughout the country, but we've really got to do a lot more work to get it better. man, you make me think about the women that get involved in some kind of sex work. And it's, well, we don't want to get into shaming of what anybody chooses. We also are very aware that many people are not choosing these lifestyles and are coerced and forced and taught that there is nothing better for them.
Yeah. Or have this history of trauma and abuse, There's a really good organization. I'm not paid for this. I'm just going to put a plug in for it because I love them so much here in Nashville, called Thistle Farms. And they have a very low recidivism. And what they do is they give women a free place to live for 2 years. And their motto is, we will love you until you learn to love yourself. Or their motto is love wins. And then they tell the women this, and they give them free place to live, teach them job skills, teach them all of these things. They have a huge waiting list, but it's amazing to see how these women go through this and start loving themselves and believing in themselves, and how that has changed the city by having that type of program here, because other places started doing this. So the judicial system did come up with, when women are arrested, they have to go through a similar program like the John School for men, but it's for women. And it's to say, what we'll do is we're going to give you a day where you're safe. You're required to be here, so you have to be. You will get tested, you'll get resources, you'll get access to all sorts of things, and we'll give you dignity and respect, and we'll give you free lunch, and you get a safe place to be for a day. And it's really been beautiful to see the shifts and changes that have happened in that particular area of criminal justice system by caring, asking the right questions. Hey, one of my goals here at the Leadership School podcast is really to provide you with a lot of resources that can really enhance your leadership. And one resource that I found recently is the Humanitarian Entrepreneur podcast. So I wanted to refer you to go check them out. What the Humanitarian Entrepreneur is doing is they're talking about what does it look like to do good in the world, but not exhaust yourself and burn yourself out and not be completely broke. Can you invest in yourself? Can you be an entrepreneur, but also change the world? And how do you do that well? So go check it out. Let us know what you think. I think it's a really great resource and really believe that you're going to benefit from it.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
This is about your listeners. Do you have a sense of how familiar they might be with the Adverse Childhood Experiences questionnaire?
I've never heard of it. No.
Okay.
The ACE one that you said? ACEs. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. So I'll try to be real brief on the background, but Kaiser Permanente, the giant insurance organization, health insurance, did a survey back, I think it was in the late 90s, of 17,000 of the people that worked in their organization. And they were, these are people across the whole spectrum, men, women, young people, more advanced in age people, and across all the racial spectrums, didn't matter. And they asked them these 10 questions that are regarding parental neglect and abuse, if someone in the family has been to jail or prison, things like, did anybody throw something or hit somebody when you were growing up? And they identified these 10 questions. And they found that for people that answered yes, it's just yes or no, did this happen to you? People who had 4 or more of these things had significant issues with not just behavioral health, like stress responses, but physical health. And they have studied those folks across their lifetime. I forget how many studies have been done on that basic data that they got, but it's in the thousands of research studies that have been looked at over time. And so these events that happen to people in their childhood, and of course, adult trauma is not insignificant either, but we know that significant life events that happen in people's childhood has a really big impact on all of the health outcomes across a person's lifetime. And that's whether or not they experienced something as traumatic or not, and whether or not they felt like they had big stress about this, or whether or not they seemed to have mental health problems. That stress, the cortisol response in our bodies shows up and has an impact on folks. And the thing that probably blew my mind the most was one study found that men who had 4 or more yes answers on that questionnaire, so that's a score of 4 or more on the ACEs questionnaire, had up to 150% more likelihood of committing violent crimes.
That's really significant data. I'm surprised that I haven't heard that. That's really helpful to know too, just in general of
Yeah. Well,
that
I'll say, you
information.
can look up
Yeah.
this questionnaire online and you can take it and just take it without any judgment about whether you think that issue affected you or not. But did it happen? And it's as simple as things as were your parents divorced during your childhood. And I mean, these things are
I've
significant and
seen
stressful.
some of these before where it's a list of not traumatic events, but high stressors, like high stress events, and check them off if you've experienced them in the last year. And I remember doing one and I had like 10 of them, and people were like, what did what to do? But moving, if you move or get a new job, things like that are high stress experiences and they do affect you and they show up. So I guess our question for our listeners here is we're talking about leadership. Okay. Do we need to be surveying people? But also, okay, what does that look like for us? You said asking the right questions. We talked about being open. It's really interesting. You said the children, and I think a lot about, as a coach, we call it inner child work, because there's a lot of modalities or therapy, different type of therapies now that focus on that and talk about it. And it's all just in different ways. And depending on which version you like, Reiki or EFT or EMDR, and you've got so many different things. But how do you refer people to things that work for them and that are helpful? How do we as leaders show up and offer those kinds of things? What do we do with the information? We know that you came out of the criminal justice system and you've probably got some trauma, or we know that just you didn't, but you do have some trauma. What do we do with that information once we have it?
Yeah. And depending on your situation, you may or may not know about that. You might suspect with somebody, but justice information is pretty well protected these days. It's same as if somebody had AIDS or a mental health issue. That's very highly protected information. And so I love the fact that you asked me earlier, maybe we should be not asking those questions or not asking to tell the story, but maybe I offer the fact that I understand that going through some difficult things in your life can be really challenging and make it tough to work. What can I do, or would it be helpful for me to know something about you so that I can help you work better? And I love those kind of questions. And then it's important to learn what's available and what's helpful. And like I mentioned before, it's really hard to talk about in just a few minutes about what all can be done, but look for the resources around you that maybe are good at working with people that have been traumatized or have some familiarity with working with other people that have been involved in the justice system of some kind. And one thing that I've learned recently is these general wellness programs where, okay, we're going to get people healthy by having them do steps, or we've got a counseling program, or we've got some yoga or breath work or whatever it might be. They're not bad, but people need individualized approaches. It's just not the same for everybody. And so having that discussion where you're open and showing that willingness and interest to help somebody is really meaningful.
Well, and I know there are organizations out there too that can come in and do assessments. So you could say, hey, everybody at the company is going to meet with this person and they're just going to do an assessment for you, on a well-being assessment. And then that person, it's independent of your company. So it's confidential to your company, but that person could say, okay, look at you. I see here's where you need in your health. You need to spend 5 more minutes at the gym, or you need a coach, or you need a therapist or physical therapy or whatever. But they can give this whole assessment of this is where you are, who you are, where you're at. And we can point you to those resources. And then maybe the company can then intervene by saying, we, just so you know, we give 1 free gym session a week. We give a therapy with this. You can just take advantage of whatever you want. And we don't care. We're funneling the funds like through that company and that organization, or how that works. I mean, there's tons of different, I guess that's what an EIP can do, but just being aware, like, let's do this for everybody. I'm not just going to pinpoint, oh, you over there, I think needs an assessment. How about we all join the train? Like,
one of the things that you're making me think of was a story I heard, and I put this into the longer talk that I do about these issues, was a woman that, kind of like we were talking about a minute ago, she ended up kind of being sex trafficked and she went to prison. And she said when she got into prison, they one day brought in some women, they put them in a group and they had them talk about their stories. And these were women that were serving life sentences, and they simply told their stories. And all of a sudden she went, that could be me. I'm sitting here serving a 4-year sentence, but I've done things, for those things that have happened to me that happened to those women. I could be in their shoes, and I'm pretty lucky not to be. And this is my chance to get some stuff together. And she kind of got some energy to get educated and to get some vocational training so that when she got out, she could get her kids back. And she now trains other people to be peer mentors. And she's got this just fantastic recovery story. So if we can put that back toward people who maybe have not had that level of extremity to their life situation, finding peers and people that have come in and somebody that's one step ahead of you has something really significant to say because you can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And so that would be a really important part of the training, to have somebody come and talk. How did I get through this situation? How did I get through my marriage difficulty, or when I was feeling suicidal, or when I was just having a really hard time recovering at work? And if you're an employer, a leader that's interested in your people, you're going to have those relationships and you're going to start to see some success stories and, find some ways to take advantage of that and get people together in meaningful ways.
Man, the power of stories. Stories just have so much power in them. And when we hear those stories of people who have heroically survived something, we're drawn to it. So I think that that's a really great idea for employers if they wanted to do like monthly workshops where they brought in, or quarterly, whatever you can afford, bring in different people who have these experiences to share their stories. And then your employees are free to make those connections with those people or not, or just to say, hey, I heard a good story, but to invest in that way too. I mean, stories are so powerful. And when we hear our own story reflected back to us, and when we hear the stories of other people, we hang on to those. I heard someone say today, she said, well, I just don't feel like I have something to offer to other people. I don't feel like I have that hook or that thing. And everybody in the conversation went, what? No, you have your story. Your story is what hooks you. Like, we want to hear that. And the more you tell your story, the more we want to hear it. You can tell it to us a dozen times. We still want to know, again, what happened and how you're doing. And so stories, just that, again, when you asked earlier, what happened in your life, what happened in your story, it's so powerful to share that and to realize no matter what community you're in, there are people who have gone through what you've gone through.
Absolutely.
This kind of leads me to the last question that I wanted to ask you. Well, I mean, actually, I probably have another dozen questions to ask you, but since you're specifically coming from the correctional system, and you mentioned someone who went and got a job after she got out, and a lot of people get out of the criminal justice system, what does it look like to hire somebody who has a criminal history? Because I feel like you said ban the box, but there's still that stigma around it. And if they do have that box, or they tell you at some point, you kind of shift and you change your perspective. But what does that look like to say, okay, yeah, you spent 2 years in prison. Can you do the job? Are you going to steal from me? Are you going to go back to prison? Like, you ask yourself those questions, but what does it look like for a leader to go to accept that and to not really judge that person? Or I don't even know what I'm asking, but I'm just thinking, how do we hold back, reserve our judgment, and give honor, dignity, and respect to somebody who is really has that past?
Well, I like the way you frame all that, even though maybe it's not a question outright. We work through these kind of thoughts that we've got. I love this. And what I'm thinking of is that approach. And, instead of, are you going to steal from me, or are you going to cause a problem, that I'm going to come in and I'm going to assume that your past is behind you. People will rise to expectations like that, especially if they feel respected. And so I think that's really important to say. And a great example that we have, and I don't have the specifics on any individuals, but I just love this because I actually recently called up our vocational area of our department. You get into a big state like Michigan, and we've got 30,000 people in prison, and other states have many more than that. But we get very separated from each other. So I do mental health work over here, and some people do job training over here, and we never talk to each other. But I think they're doing great work. And we actually have one of our statewide electricity companies that approached us and said, we're having a really hard time getting workers. Could we come up with some ways to train people so that they can climb trees and fix power lines and things like that? And so you get this cooperation where on both sides, we're raising those expectations, hopes, and dreams, and we're getting people's skills up. So, I can trust you to work on this. And as you're working your way towards serving your time and getting out of prison, we're going to have you all ready to go. And then we've got this direct connection with some people that are just really eager to hire a person that wants to work. And that's just what we expect right now. We expect that you want to work. We want to give you a job and get the job done. And I think having that attitude is really helpful for folks to just look at it that way. Now, the other end of it is having that awareness that there could be some things that go wrong. We've got people that have been through more than what the average person has been through, and they're probably going to have some struggles. And so keep an eye out. Have your managers educated, possibly even be at a level where they are trauma informed. They've taken enough awareness trainings to say, hey, I'm trauma informed, and our management style is being trauma informed. So I can recognize when somebody looks like they're not sleeping well, looks like they're getting really irritated about things that they don't normally get irritated about, and be willing to kind of jump in and say, hey, what's going on? Is there something I can help you with? Is there something we can do better? Because I noticed this and this and this, and just want to see if I can help out.
Better. There's something we can do better. That's awesome. What that does too is what you're talking about is building community. It's saying that life isn't meant to be lived on our own. And you don't have to live in isolation because you've been in prison. You don't have to live your life in this holding on to that shame of that past and that story. Like, let us be part of this community of your support system, because I need a community too. I need a support system too. You can be part of mine. And it's the building a place. Work is such a great place to build community. Sometimes you have to have boundaries with it. I think you have to have boundaries with everything. I had a job one time where it felt like a big frat party. And I was like, this isn't working for me, but it worked really well for other people. So community is really, really important. If you have that at the place that you spend 40 plus hours a week, it could be a really valuable place to really grow as a person and for others to grow too. It's sometimes we forget that when we share our story, it helps other people too. Someone asks me that question, can you tell me your story? The more I hold back, the less I'm allowing that person to be part of my life and me to be part of theirs. So to be able to have some courage to be vulnerable. Do you guys talk about that in the work that you do, as about that vulnerability and having that courage to just really own who you are and share it and move past it forward?
In some of the therapies that we do, especially group for substance use disorders. And then something I also really want to talk about is people that commit sex offenses. And we do groups for them as well. But it's hard in prison. So you have to be really cautious, because there are a lot of people in there that are not putting their criminal behavior behind them, and they will take advantage of each other. And so it's hard to be very self-disclosing in a group in those settings. And so I'd say a little bit yes and no. But in the right settings, we do. But
and learn who's safe and who's not. Learn where the safe places are,
and do some training about being safe, the importance of it. We're working on changing that, actually, because we used to call it sex offender therapy, and we actually want to call it now sexual abuse prevention, so that we, even with that kind of behavior, not labeling somebody. Because despite the fact that most of us have this kind of common wisdom that people that commit sexually offensive behaviors are going to do it again, most of them don't when they get out of prison. And especially if they've been given some therapy around those things. And then also, especially if we identify the right people and kind of target that behavior. But, there's something like some information out there that 90% or 90+% of them will recommit these offenses. And it's really, for the average person that offends that way, under 5% of individuals will recommit these crimes. There obviously are some very risky individuals, and they're the scary ones. But what you said a minute ago triggered me to begin thinking about this again. Community. What's most likely to make somebody act out again? If they're feeling alone, isolated, and they're not worth anything to anybody else or the world around them. We get good behavior by being in good community and good relationships. And so foster an environment where people care about each other and care about doing good things.
This is so great because I know we're talking about this particular crime, but because of the John School that I do, this is what I always say in that class. And one of the first things I say is, who knows that you're here? Does anybody know that you're here? And if they don't, maybe it's time to think of who can you trust to share this with somebody, because you need to start inviting people into your life if you don't have that. And we're really good about saying every person well, maybe not every person, but we all try to come into this class as a teaching and to say, I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to offer you information and education because, well, at the John School, you get it's like a free gift from the state of Tennessee. You get to come to this class and then you can get your rest expunged. And so we can say, this might be the first time that you hear. For a lot of people, it is. For a lot of people, it's not, or it's not the first time they've acted out, but to be able to say, we care about you. So here's what we're going to do is we're going to give you these resources. And gosh, I get excited talking about this because it's one of my favorite things I've done. I've been involved in this class for 10 years or so. And it's really fun to come in and say, what things give you life? What things give you life? What hobbies are you invested in? What do you enjoy? Last time I had someone say fishing. Somebody else said guns and hunting. And I was like freaked out because I'm a pacifist and I don't like guns. But I was like, hey, if that's your thing, go, like invest in it, do that and have people in your life so that when something comes up, when you think, I have to go do this thing, we're adults. I always say we are grown adults. And as grown adults, it is very difficult to change habits and patterns in your life. But when you have community and you've planned ahead and you've thought through it, you can actually change your patterns, but you have to acknowledge your pattern, know what it is, and be prepared for when it comes up again. I always say this, go and invite those people so that when you think, hey, I want to go rob the liquor store next door because I'm out of cash, you can call your buddy and your buddy can say, hey, how about we go get a job together and we go do this job I know. And someone can help you in that community. And when you're finding and you're around good people, when you're around people you want to be like, that overflows. I think this is a little bit veering, but I just get really passionate talking about the John School because I'm really proud of the work that we do there.
Yeah, and I love that you're doing that in Nashville. I lived down there back in the 90s for a few years and love the town.
Oh, yeah,
great
it's fun.
Place.
It is. So, when we think about too, like we're taking that information as leaders, and if we come to the people that we're leading, if we come to our teams, we come to our employees, come to our coworkers with this idea of, I'm not here to judge you and your past and your story. I'm here to say, what's your story today and what's your story tomorrow? And how can we be part of that together?
That's really inspiring stuff that's going on. I have a note here that as I was talking with our vocational folks, so thinking about leaders and employers, one of the biggest struggles that people have getting over that hump when they get out of prison is transportation and housing. And so if you're seeking out some help in finding workers, they do tend to have struggles with that. So be thinking about these just very real issues. And sometimes folks need a little bit of help before they can talk about their trauma issues with somebody. They just need some basics for life. And so finding resources that can help them or being connected with good folks that can help out is going to be really important.
And that goes back to what you were saying at the very beginning of this episode about being aware and paying attention. So if you notice, someone's showing up late to work every day, maybe it's because they missed the first bus or they're having trouble with their transportation or they didn't have a safe place to sleep, things like that. If you're paying attention and noticing, then you know what questions to ask. And then you can find the right appropriate resources. You want your workers, you want your employees and your team to be well. I think most of us want that.
Absolutely. Because if they're not, you don't have a workforce. And that's the number one thing for employers is to have some people that can get the job done and show up every day.
Yes. Yes. Hey, thanks so much for listening. Since you've listened this far, it tells me you're really enjoying the content. And I'm so, so grateful. I work really hard to bring you some awesome resources to help really enhance your leadership game. If you're liking this, can you pause really quickly? Make sure you're subscribed, but then also share with one person or more people who you think could really benefit from the content. My goal is to really bring this into some of the top podcasts on leadership in the world, and you can help get there and help us grow by sharing this with everyone you know. Thank you so much. I'm glad you're enjoying the episode. Okay, so let's recap here. We talked about being aware, asking the right questions. We talked about the ACE test and finding resources, different options for that, and just looking for that. Your training that you do for people, that training is specific for the judicial system.
The one that I am kind of certified or trained to give, it's by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration from the federal government, and it's specific to the justice system. But I might have to look a little bit because I'm so involved with the criminal justice area. I haven't looked a lot at how trauma-informed practices might be helpful in other situations outside of justice and healthcare, because that's where those issues tend to show up the most. But, we've got all the people that listen to you that are leading and have people to work with. And it's really important for them.
Yeah. Well, what I really love about this time that we're living in, 2022 is when we're recording this, is that there really are a lot of good resources. And what's cool is that every time something is studied, tested, created, it's built upon. And so we've got years and years and years of information, and people have learning things. And so if you're looking for a resource, I think there's really honestly, I really think there's no excuse for not informing yourself or saying that, oh, well, I didn't have the information available to me. If it intrigues you at all, if you're listening to this at all, the information is out there. You just have to be willing to maybe do a little work to find it. And David is here as a resource. I'm here as a resource. I mean, there are so many resources, and we just want people to have full, rich, happy, healthy lives.
Absolutely. I think that today it's easy to get overwhelmed with information and the bad information. So do look to experts and the things that have been vetted about these kind of things. But if you can take a couple of steps toward being trauma informed, it'll make a vast difference in how you see people. How do you see the people that are around you?
Yeah. Real quick, what do we do when somebody comes to us with a story that might cause our own trauma or is too much for us? Personally, like if there's just a story that you're like, I don't know what to do with what I just heard. I don't know how to interact. I don't know what to say next. I don't know what to do. What can we do in those situations?
Wow. It's a big question, isn't it? Because sometimes something's happening in your body that you don't have words for when you react to a situation like that. And for me, it connects back to what you said a minute ago about being informed. And so have I taken some steps just to learn how to calm my body down when I start to have a stress reaction? Do I look at that for myself? And as you do that, you learn to recognize it in other people as well. But do that work so that when you do start to have those feelings of overwhelm or whatever it is, you can take that step back and say, I really want to have you get some help in this situation. And right now, I might not be the person to do that with you, but I care about you. I want us to work together. I want this to continue. Let's bring in another person to help us, or let's connect in this other way. But if you are an individual that has some stress responses and you realize that you haven't done the work to be aware, then do that work. It's hard and it's scary, but be willing to look at some of those things.
Even one step beyond that, though, is like, how do we set up those boundaries so it's not when someone approaches us with some sort of information or piece of their story that we're not left wondering, okay, what do I do? Like, let's use this as an example. If someone comes up to you and says, I've got two different examples. Someone comes up to you and says, I'm anorexic. Your employee or your coworker says, I'm anorexic. I don't eat. I don't ever do this. What do you do with that information? You're like, okay, fist bump. No, you don't do that. I mean, what would be the appropriate step that someone could take? Is that part of what you do in this training? And the other thought too is, what if someone comes to you and says, I'm suicidal, I'm depressed, something like that? These are big things that people can maybe reveal to you. How do you manage a revelation like that?
You have to be prepared so that you're not on the back foot and just going, whoa, hey man, I don't know what to do with that right now. You've got a person who is maybe scared or looking for something they don't know what to do with. And you might not be the person that's going to handle it, but you're willing to step with them and figure out what the next step is.
I'm here for you. I'm here for you.
Yeah. I'm not going to be afraid of this, but I'm going to help figure out what to do. Even though right now I'm not sure what that step is, we're going to do this together.
And what's the responsibility in that too? At what point do we have a responsibility or we don't have a responsibility?
I think if you know somebody is imminently going to harm themselves or somebody else, I think you do have a responsibility just to see it through, to know what the crisis line number is, and that you've got that available.
Okay. Yeah. But it's not your responsibility to fix it.
You don't have to fix it. No. But know where to refer, who else to call, even if it's just, hey, I don't know what to do. Do you have an idea of how you can help us through this? There are crisis lines in every state, in most cities, and some kind of help available. So do have those resources available if you're working with people. It's a risky business, isn't it? Working with people.
Right.
And difficult.
Being human.
Mm-hmm.
Being human. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, you don't have to solve it. But as a manager and a boss, sometimes that's just been my humble response is, I don't know, but I'm willing to try and find out how or what.
I don't know, but I care. And we're going to do this. You're not going to be left alone, community. Awesome. David, how can we find you and get in touch with you?
All right. So as far as speaking about these things, I do have a website, and it's just jdaviddawdy.com, because my real first name is John. So I'll throw the initial in there. And I have an email at that address as well, or Gmail, jdaviddawdy@gmail, and love to talk about these things. And also, since I brought up the trauma-informed training, the SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, has a website, I should say a portion of their website, dedicated to finding trainers that do this work, and my name is listed on there as well. They like to have, I think they've got trainers in every state now, so if you're in another state other than Michigan, there's probably somebody near you that can do that. But I love doing it and talking about it.
That's great. Well, we can put that link in the show notes as well. Awesome. Is there, oh, you know what? I didn't ask my 2 questions. We're here at the end of our time. I didn't ask my questions. So I'm going to ask those quickly. What does integrity mean to you?
You know, I've been in interviews all day, and I've been asking people what their top 3 leadership skills are. And we got a lot of integrity today. And so I heard some different answers. But it really means doing what you say you're going to do, and just showing up with some authenticity. This is me. Haven't got it all together, but willing to give it a shot.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, what about balance, especially in the mental health field? Finding balance. What does it look like for you to live a balanced life?
You know, I've heard all kinds of things about that. There's a million thoughts going through my head, because there's lots about work-life balance, right? But is anything ever really in balance? You're kind of doing one thing or doing another. I do think what we talked about earlier is really important. That is being aware and present. What's going on with me right now? And what do I really need? Because sometimes I need to completely shut down and do something mindless. Sometimes I need to go for a walk. Sometimes I need to connect with someone. And being willing to look inside a little bit and just be aware of what you are telling you. And that can take some practice, but I think that's where you find balance, is what direction do I need to go right now for me and my community, my family.
Yeah. Awesome. Was there anything else you want to make sure you say before we head out?
I don't think so. That was a great conversation. We covered a lot. There's lots more to say, but
it's an all-day topic, or all weekend, all month, all everything. And this is Mental Health Awareness Month when we're recording this here in May. But yeah, David, this was really, really helpful and really great. It's an important conversation, and I'm glad that we're having it. And I'm grateful to you for the work that you're doing. Thank you so much for being here and joining me. Thank you for joining me on this journey to grow in our leadership. If you enjoyed this episode, you've got to check out the leadership and self-care coaching programs on my website at kylakofer.com. Let's change the world together.